Sarah never imagined her perfect wedding day would end with her sitting alone in her bridal suite, tears streaming down her face, wondering where her new husband had disappeared to. The ceremony had been everything she dreamed of: white roses, twinkling lights, and 200 guests celebrating their love story that began in college 5 years ago. Marcus had looked handsome in his black tuxedo, his smile bright as he slipped the diamond ring onto her finger. Their first dance was magical, spinning slowly to their favorite song while everyone watched with happy tears. Sarah felt like a princess in her flowing white gown, her mother's pearl necklace catching the light perfectly. But as the evening progressed, something felt different about Marcus. During dinner, he seemed distracted, checking his phone repeatedly and barely touching his food. When their friends gave speeches, he laughed at all the right moments, but Sarah noticed his eyes looked distant, almost worried. The reception was in full swing when Marcus pulled Sarah aside near the chocolate fountain. His hands were sweating, and he kept looking toward the exit. "I need to step out for a few minutes," he whispered, kissing her cheek quickly. "Business emergency. I'll be right back, I promise." Sarah watched him walk toward the hotel lobby, confused but trusting. She spent the next hour mingling with relatives, accepting congratulations, and posing for more photos with the bridesmaids. Her feet ached in the expensive heels, and she kept glancing at the entrance, waiting for Marcus to return with his warm smile and terrible jokes. When the band announced the last dance, panic crept into Sarah's chest. Where was her husband? She asked his best man, David, who just shrugged and said Marcus had mentioned something about a phone call. Her new mother-in-law hadn't seen him either, though she tried to hide her own concern behind a forced smile. The guests began leaving, offering hugs and thanks for the beautiful celebration. Sarah's parents helped pack up the gifts while she searched the hotel grounds in her wedding dress, her heart pounding with each empty hallway she explored. The garden where they'd taken photos was deserted, moonlight casting long shadows across the carefully trimmed hedges. Finally, she returned to their honeymoon suite on the top floor, expecting to find Marcus there with a reasonable explanation and maybe room service champagne waiting. Instead, she found only silence and the faint scent of the rose petals the hotel staff had scattered across the king-size bed. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her elaborate hairstyle coming undone, trying to make sense of the evening. Marcus wasn't the type to just leave without explanation. He was responsible, considerate, the kind of man who called when he was 5 minutes late. Something was seriously wrong, but she couldn't imagine what could be so urgent that he'd abandon their wedding reception. She tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. His cheerful recorded message felt mocking now. "Hey, you've reached Marcus. Leave me a message and I'll call you back soon." She hung up without speaking, fear and confusion battling in her mind. The wedding dress felt heavy now, no longer magical, but suffocating. Sarah struggled with the dozens of tiny buttons down her back, finally managing to change into the silk nightgown she'd bought specially for tonight. The romantic evening she'd planned seemed impossible now, replaced by worry and a growing sense that something terrible had happened. She paced the luxurious suite, past the champagne bucket with melting ice, past the congratulations cards from the hotel staff, past the window overlooking the city lights. Each minute that passed felt like an hour, and with each hour her anxiety grew stronger. By midnight, Sarah was calling hospitals, her voice shaking as she asked if anyone matching Marcus's description had been brought in. The nurses were kind but had no information. She called the police, but they explained that an adult missing for only a few hours wasn't considered an emergency, especially when there were no signs of foul play. Alone in the honeymoon suite, still wearing her wedding rings, Sarah finally allowed herself to cry. Not delicate tears that wouldn't ruin her makeup, but deep, painful sobs that shook her whole body. This wasn't how their story was supposed to begin. Sarah woke up on the hotel couch as sunlight streamed through the heavy curtains, her neck stiff and her heart immediately racing as reality crashed back. Marcus still hadn't come home. The bed remained untouched, rose petals now wilted and scattered, on the floor where she'd paced the night before. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from her mother and sister, along with text messages asking how the honeymoon suite was and whether she was enjoying married life. Sarah stared at the messages, unsure how to respond. How could she explain that her husband had vanished on their wedding night without any explanation? She showered and put on jeans and a sweater, her wedding dress hanging like a ghost in the closet. The hotel staff knocked gently to deliver breakfast, their cheerful congratulations feeling like salt in fresh wounds. Sarah forced a smile and accepted the champagne and strawberries, closing the door quickly before they could see her red, swollen eyes. Desperation drove her to call David again. Marcus's best man sounded genuinely confused when she explained the situation, insisting that Marcus had seemed perfectly normal during the bachelor party the week before. He was excited about the wedding, talking about your honeymoon plans, showing everyone the surprise he'd planned for you, David said, his voice growing concerned. What surprise? Sarah asked, gripping the phone tighter. He didn't tell you? He'd arranged something special for your first anniversary, bought tickets to that Broadway show you love, made reservations at that fancy restaurant where you had your first date. He was so proud of himself for planning ahead. This made Marcus's disappearance even more confusing. Why would someone planning romantic surprises suddenly abandon his new wife on their wedding night? Sarah thanked David and hung up, more bewildered than before. Her sister Emma arrived at noon with coffee and bagels, taking one look at Sarah's appearance and immediately wrapping her in a fierce hug. Emma was practical, the type who solved problems instead of just worrying about them. Together, they began making a list of everywhere Marcus might be and everyone who might know something. They called his office, but his secretary explained that Marcus had taken 2 weeks off for the honeymoon and wasn't expected back until the following Monday. His gym hadn't seen him, his favorite coffee shop hadn't either. His college roommate lived across the country and hadn't heard from Marcus in months. Maybe he got cold feet? Emma suggested gently, though her expression showed she didn't really believe it. Sometimes people panic after big life changes, even when they want them. Sarah shook her head firmly. Marcus isn't like that. He's been planning this wedding for months, talking about buying a house together, about having kids someday. He was happy, Emma. I know he was happy. That afternoon, they drove to Marcus's apartment, hoping to find clues about where he might have gone. Sarah used her key, the one he'd given her 6 months ago, with a joke about her officially moving in. The apartment looked exactly as they'd left it 3 days earlier, clothes scattered around from packing for the honeymoon, wedding gifts still, in boxes waiting to be opened. But Emma noticed something Sarah had missed. The small safe in Marcus's bedroom closet was open and empty. Sarah knew he kept important documents there, his passport, birth certificate, some cash for emergencies. Everything was gone. On his desk, Emma found something even more disturbing. Printed emails from someone named Jennifer, dated just 2 days before the wedding. The messages were brief but intimate, talking about finally being together and making. Sure, no one gets hurt. Sarah's hands trembled as she read them, each word feeling like a physical blow. Who is Jennifer? Emma asked softly. Sarah had no idea. Marcus had never mentioned anyone by that name, and there was no Jennifer among their mutual friends or co-workers. She searched through his contacts, his social media, even old photos on his computer, but found no trace of this mysterious woman who seemed to know her husband well enough to exchange intimate messages. The worst part was the timestamp on the last email, sent just 4 hours before their wedding ceremony began. While Sarah was having her hair done and laughing with her bridesmaids, Marcus was apparently making plans with another woman. Emma suggested they take the emails to the police, but Sarah hesitated. Part of her still hoped there was an innocent, explanation that Marcus would walk through the door with flowers and apologies and a reasonable story that made sense of everything. But as the second night approached and her phone remained silent, hope was becoming harder to maintain. They returned to the hotel, where Sarah's parents were waiting in the lobby with worried faces and gentle questions. Sarah couldn't bring herself to tell them about Jennifer yet, instead focusing on the basic facts. Marcus had left the reception and hadn't returned. Her father, usually calm and measured, looked furious. "What kind of man abandons his wife on their wedding night?" he muttered, pacing the hotel lobby like a caged animal. Her mother was already talking about calling lawyers and banks, protecting Sarah from whatever financial mess might be coming. That night, Sarah lay in the hotel bed that was supposed to witness the beginning of her married life, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she'd ever really known Marcus at all. The man she'd fallen in love with, planned a future with, trusted completely, was apparently capable of deceptions she'd never imagined. 3 days after the wedding, Sarah finally worked up the courage to visit the police station with the printed emails. Detective Rodriguez, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, listened carefully as Sarah explained the situation. She examined the emails, asked detailed questions about Marcus's behavior, and promised to look into it, though she warned that adults had the right to leave if they chose to. "The emails are concerning," Detective Rodriguez admitted, "but they don't necessarily indicate criminal activity. However, the timing and circumstances are unusual enough that we can open a missing person case." Sarah left the station feeling slightly better, knowing that professionals were now involved. But that relief disappeared when she returned to her apartment to find her credit card statements in the mail. Marcus had been authorized on her account since their engagement, and the recent activity made her sick to her stomach. Large cash withdrawals had been made from her account over the past 2 weeks, totaling nearly $8,000. The transactions were at ATMs across town, all bearing Marcus's signature. While Sarah had been focused on wedding preparations, trusting her fiancé completely, he had been systematically draining her savings. Emma helped her call the bank immediately to freeze the accounts and report the unauthorized withdrawals. The customer service representative was sympathetic but explained that since Marcus had been legally authorized to access the funds, recovering the money would be complicated and might require legal action. He planned this, Sarah realized, her voice hollow as she stared at the bank statements. This wasn't a sudden decision or cold feet. He's been planning to disappear for weeks. That evening, Sarah's phone finally rang with Marcus's number. Her heart leaped with hope until she heard the voice on the other end, a woman's voice, nervous but determined. "Is this Sarah?" the woman asked. "Yes. Who is this?" Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "My name is Jennifer. I think we need to talk." They agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown the next morning. Sarah barely slept, imagining what this mysterious woman might look like, what she might say, whether she held the answers to questions that had been torturing Sarah for days. Jennifer turned out to be younger than Sarah expected, maybe 25 with short dark hair and expensive clothes. She was clearly nervous, fidgeting with her purse and glancing around the coffee shop as if expecting someone to appear. "I'm sorry," Jennifer began immediately, her words rushing together. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know about the wedding until it was too late." Sarah sat across from her, studying this woman who had somehow stolen her husband. Jennifer was pretty but not stunning, seemed educated but not particularly sophisticated. Sarah couldn't understand what Marcus saw in her that he hadn't found in their 5-year relationship. "How long?" Sarah asked simply. 6 months, Jennifer admitted, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. "We met at his gym. I had just moved to town for a new job, didn't know anyone. He was friendly, offered to show me around the city. I had no idea he was engaged." Jennifer explained that Marcus had told her he was single, that he worked as a consultant and traveled frequently for business. He'd taken her to restaurants in different neighborhoods, always paying cash, never taking her to places where they might encounter people who knew about Sarah. "He was so charming," Jennifer continued, tears starting to form in her eyes. "He talked about wanting to settle down, maybe start a family. I thought we had a real future together. Then last month, a friend of mine saw him at a bridal shop with you. She took a picture and showed me." Sarah's stomach clenched. She remembered that day clearly. They'd been choosing flowers for the centerpieces, laughing about Marcus's inability to tell roses from peonies. While she'd been planning their wedding, believing they were building a life together, he'd been living a completely separate life with another woman. Jennifer pulled out her phone and showed Sarah dozens of text messages from Marcus over the past weeks. He'd been torn between two lives, apparently genuinely caring for both women, but unable to choose between them. The messages revealed a man in crisis, desperate to avoid hurting either of them, but ultimately betraying both. "The night before your wedding," Jennifer said quietly, "he called me crying. Said he couldn't go through with it, that he loved me and wanted to start over somewhere new. He begged me to leave town with him that very night." Sarah felt like she was hearing about a stranger, not the man she'd shared a bed and dreams with for years. "So you said yes?" Jennifer nodded miserably. "I was stupid. I was so in love with him that I convinced myself it was romantic, like we were eloping. He picked me up at midnight after your reception, said he'd left you a note explaining everything. But Sarah had never found any note. Either Marcus had been lying to Jennifer about that, or he'd chickened out at the last minute, unable to face even that small act of honesty. They'd driven to the airport together, Jennifer explained, using tickets. Marcus had bought with Sarah's money. But at the gate, Marcus had suddenly panicked. He'd seen a news report about their wedding on someone's phone. Apparently their story had made local news as a feel-good piece about college sweethearts. And seeing Sarah in her wedding dress had made everything real. "He started hyperventilating," Jennifer said. "Said he couldn't believe what he'd done, that he'd ruined everything. He gave me his phone, told me to call you, then just walked away. I haven't seen him since." Sarah stared at this woman who'd unknowingly helped destroy her marriage before it could even begin. Jennifer seemed genuine in her remorse, but that didn't lessen the pain of betrayal or answer the most important question. Where was Marcus now? "I've been calling hotels, checking his credit cards," Jennifer added. "I think he might have gone to his brother's place in Colorado, but Tom hasn't returned my calls." For the first time since the wedding night, Sarah felt like she had a concrete lead. Marcus's brother Tom lived in Denver and had always been Marcus's confidant during difficult times. If Marcus was anywhere, it would be there, trying to figure out how to clean up the mess he'd made of his life. Sarah booked a flight to Denver that same afternoon, driven by a mixture of anger, heartbreak, and desperate need for answers. She'd called Tom repeatedly from the airport, but his phone went straight to voicemail each time. Emma had begged her to wait, to let the police handle it, but Sarah couldn't sit still any longer. She needed to confront Marcus face to face and understand how the man she'd loved could have deceived her so completely. The flight gave her 3 hours to think, to replay every moment of their relationship looking for signs she'd missed. Had Marcus seemed distracted during their engagement party? Had his late work nights really been work? She remembered him changing his phone password a few months ago, claiming his company required new security measures. At the time, she'd trusted him completely. Now, every memory felt tainted with doubt. Tom's apartment complex was in a quiet Denver suburb, surrounded by mountains that looked peaceful in the late afternoon sunlight. Sarah sat in her rental car for several minutes, gathering courage. Part of her was terrified of what she might find inside. Marcus with Jennifer, Marcus with someone else entirely, or worst of all, Marcus who looked her in the eye and said he'd never loved her at all. When Tom opened the door, his face went pale. He was clearly Marcus's brother. Same dark eyes, same stubborn jawline. But where Marcus had always been confident and charming, Tom looked exhausted and stressed. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I wondered when you'd show up." "Is he here?" she asked, directly. Tom nodded and stepped aside to let her in. The apartment was messy, with empty pizza boxes and beer bottles scattered around. Sarah could hear the shower running in the back bedroom, and her heart started pounding. After 4 days of wondering and worrying, she was finally going to get answers. "He's pretty messed up," Tom warned as they sat in his living room. "I've never seen him like this. He showed up at my door 3 nights ago looking like he hadn't slept in days, talking about how he'd ruined his entire life." "Good," Sarah said harshly, surprising herself with the venom in her voice. "He deserves to feel terrible after what he did." The shower turned off, and Sarah heard movement in the bedroom. Her hands were shaking now. 5 years of love and trust and shared dreams colliding with the reality of betrayal and lies. When Marcus finally appeared in the doorway wearing jeans and a t-shirt, his hair still damp, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. "Sarah." Her name came out as barely a whisper. He looked genuinely shocked to see her, though she couldn't understand why he'd be surprised that his wife would try to find him. "Sit down," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're going to talk, and you're going to tell me the truth about everything." Marcus sat on the opposite end of the couch, keeping as much distance between them as possible. His eyes were red and puffy, his usually perfect hair a mess. He looked like a man who'd been crying for days, though Sarah found it hard to feel sympathy for him. "I'm so sorry," he began. But Sarah cut him off. "I don't want apologies. I want explanations. I want to know how long you've been lying to me, how much of our relationship was real, and why you thought disappearing on our wedding night was better than just being honest." The story that came out over the next hour was worse than Sarah had imagined. Marcus admitted that his feelings for her had started changing about a year ago, though he couldn't explain exactly why. He'd felt trapped by their wedding plans but hadn't known how to express his doubts without destroying their relationship and disappointing their families. Meeting Jennifer had given him an escape, a way to experience the excitement and novelty he felt was missing from his relationship with Sarah. But instead of ending things with Sarah honestly, he'd convinced himself he could manage both relationships until he figured out what he really wanted. "I thought I could make a decision after the wedding," he said miserably. "I thought maybe once we were married I'd feel different, more settled. But when I was standing at the altar looking at you in your wedding dress, all I could think about was Jennifer." Sarah felt like she was hearing about her wedding day from someone else's perspective, learning that while she'd been feeling pure joy and love, her groom had been thinking about another woman. The betrayal cut deeper than she'd thought possible. "So, you stole my money and ran away with her," Sarah said flatly. "I panicked," Marcus admitted. "I knew I was making a terrible mistake, but I couldn't figure out how to stop it. Taking the money was horrible. I planned to pay it back, I swear. And leaving with Jennifer was supposed to be temporary, just until I could figure out how to handle everything." "But you couldn't handle it," Tom interjected, his voice full of disgust for his brother's choices. "You realized that running away didn't solve anything, that you'd just made everything worse." Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face now. "Jennifer was so angry when I abandoned her at the airport. She said I'd ruined her life too, made her complicit in hurting you. And she was right. I hurt everyone I claimed to care about." Sarah sat in silence, processing everything she'd heard. The Marcus she'd fallen in love with, responsible, thoughtful, honest, had apparently been an act, or at least only one side of a much more complicated and selfish person. She'd built her future around someone who'd never really existed. "What do you want from me now?" she asked, finally. Marcus looked up hopefully. "I want to try to fix this. I want to come home and make it up to you somehow. I know I don't deserve it, but I love you, Sarah. I made terrible choices, but underneath all the mess, I love you." The words she'd been longing to hear for 4 days now felt empty and meaningless. Love wasn't just a feeling. It was actions, choices, commitment. Marcus had shown her exactly what his version of love looked like, and it wasn't something she could build a life on? No, she said quietly, and saw his face crumble. You don't get to destroy everything and then decide you want it back. You don't get to hurt me this badly, and then ask me to pretend it never happened. The confrontation with Marcus lasted 3 more hours, growing more painful as the truth continued to unfold. Sarah learned that their entire relationship had been built on lies bigger than she'd imagined. The business trips he'd taken over the past year weren't all for work. Some had been romantic getaways with Jennifer. The expensive restaurant receipts she'd found in his pockets weren't from client dinners, but from dates with another woman. Even worse, Marcus admitted that he'd been having doubts about their relationship long before he met Jennifer, but had proposed anyway because he felt pressured by their families and friends who kept asking when he was going to make it official. The ring she'd worn so proudly, the engagement she'd celebrated with joy, had been given reluctantly by a man who was already planning his escape route. I thought marriage might change how I felt, Marcus said weakly. I thought the commitment would make me love you the way you deserved. You can't fake love, Marcus, Sarah replied, her voice hollow with exhaustion. And you definitely can't build a marriage on hoping your feelings will change. Tom had left them alone to talk, but Sarah could hear him moving around the kitchen, probably as uncomfortable with the situation as she was. This wasn't how she'd imagined her first week of marriage. Sitting in a stranger's living room listening to her husband confess to months of elaborate deception. Marcus kept begging for another chance, promising he'd changed, swearing he'd learned from his mistakes. But Sarah had heard enough empty promises to last a lifetime. The man sitting across from her wasn't the person she'd fallen in love with. He was a stranger who'd been wearing Marcus's face for months, maybe years. I need time to think, she finally said, standing up from the couch. I need to figure out what happens next, legally and financially, but I can't do that with you trying to convince me to forgive you. Where will you go? Marcus asked, looking panicked at the thought of her leaving. That's not your concern anymore, Sarah replied, though the harsh words felt foreign in her mouth. She'd never been cruel to Marcus before, even during their worst arguments. But this situation required a different version of herself. One who could protect her own interests instead of trying to make everyone else comfortable. Tom walked her to the door, his expression apologetic. For what it's worth, I told him he was making a huge mistake, he said quietly. I've never seen him as happy as he was with you, at least in the beginning. I think he got scared of how real it was becoming. Being scared doesn't justify what he did, Sarah replied. And being happy with someone doesn't mean you get to destroy them when that happiness becomes inconvenient. The flight back home felt longer than the trip to Denver. Sarah spent most of it staring out the window, trying to process everything she'd learned. The Marcus she'd confronted was broken and remorseful, but he was also the same person who'd been capable of such elaborate deception. Could people really change that dramatically, or had she simply never seen his true nature before? Emma picked her up at the airport, taking one look at Sarah's face and wrapping her in a fierce hug without asking any questions. They drove home in comfortable silence, Sarah grateful for a sister who understood that sometimes the most supportive thing was just being present without trying to fix everything. At home, Sarah found her apartment exactly as she'd left it, but everything felt different now. The photos of her and Marcus looked like pictures of strangers. The wedding gifts stacked in the corner seemed to mock her with their cheerful ribbons and cards, wishing them happiness. Even her own reflection looked unfamiliar. She was still the same person, but she felt fundamentally changed by what she'd experienced. The hardest part was calling her parents and telling them what had happened. Her mother cried, her father raged, and both of them wanted to fly out immediately to take care of her. But Sarah found herself wanting to handle this alone, to prove to herself that she was strong enough to survive the worst betrayal she'd ever experienced. I'm proud of you, her mother said through tears. It would have been easier to forgive him and pretend everything was fine, but you're choosing to respect yourself instead. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad, making lists of everything that needed to be done. Cancel the honeymoon reservations, return the wedding gifts, file for annulment or divorce, change her bank account passwords, find a lawyer. Divide up 5 years' worth of shared possessions and memories. The practical tasks felt manageable compared to the emotional work ahead. Sarah knew she'd have to grieve not just the end of her marriage, but the end of the future she'd planned. The person she'd thought she was marrying, and the version of herself who'd trusted so completely that she'd missed all the warning signs. But for the first time since her wedding night, Sarah also felt something like hope. She was 28, years old, financially stable, surrounded by people who loved her. Marcus's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also shown her that she was capable of surviving much more than she'd ever imagined. The woman who'd sat crying in her wedding dress 4 days ago had felt helpless and lost. The woman making lists at her kitchen table felt angry and hurt, but also determined to build something better from the wreckage of her marriage. Maybe that was what growing up really meant, learning that you could be broken and still not be destroyed. 6 months later, Sarah sat in her lawyer's office, signing the final divorce papers. The annulment she'd originally wanted wasn't possible, given how long they'd been together before the marriage, but the divorce had been surprisingly straightforward. Marcus hadn't fought her on anything. The division of assets, the recovery of her stolen money, or even her request that he pay for her legal fees. He'd tried calling several times in the weeks after Denver, but Sarah had blocked his number after the third tearful voicemail promising he'd changed. She'd learned through Tom that Marcus was seeing a therapist and had broken things off completely with Jennifer. But Sarah no longer cared about his journey toward becoming a better person. That work was his responsibility, not hers. Jennifer had actually reached out once more, sending a long email apologizing again and explaining that she'd also been seeing a counselor to understand how she'd allowed herself to become involved in such a situation. Sarah had appreciated the gesture, but hadn't responded. Some chapters of your life needed to be closed completely, not revisited endlessly. The recovery process had been harder than Sarah expected, even though she logically knew that Marcus's deception wasn't her fault. She found herself analyzing every relationship decision she'd ever made, wondering if she'd been naive or willfully blind to red flags. Her therapist helped her understand that trusting someone you love isn't a character flaw, even when that trust is betrayed. Sarah had moved to a new apartment across town, wanting a fresh start in a place that held no memories of Marcus. She'd kept some of their shared possessions, books they'd both enjoyed, a coffee maker they'd bought together, but donated most everything else. Starting over required letting go of the physical reminders of a life that had turned out to be largely fictional. The hardest part was learning to trust her own judgment again. Dating seemed impossible when she couldn't be sure if she'd recognize deception the next time. Her friends kept encouraging her to get back out there, but Sarah wasn't ready for that level of vulnerability yet. She needed to rebuild her confidence in her own instincts before she could risk her heart again. Work had been a welcome distraction. Sarah had thrown herself into her marketing job with new intensity, taking on challenging projects and working toward the promotion she'd been considering. Before the wedding, her boss had been understanding about the personal crisis, and Sarah found that professional success helped restore some of her confidence in other areas of life. The financial recovery had taken months, but was finally complete. Marcus had repaid the money he'd stolen, plus interest, and covered all the wedding expenses that couldn't be recovered from vendors. Sarah had been able to put most of the money toward a down payment on her new apartment, turning his betrayal into an investment in her independent future. Her family had been incredible throughout the entire ordeal. Her parents had wanted to confront Marcus themselves, but respected Sarah's decision to handle things through lawyers. Emma had become even closer to Sarah, calling regularly and planning sister trips to help create new, happier memories. Their relationship had deepened through shared crisis in a way that might never have happened otherwise. Sarah had also discovered strength in helping others going through similar situations. She'd started volunteering with a support group for people dealing with betrayal and divorce, finding that sharing her story helped both her own healing and other people's recovery. There was something powerful about turning personal pain into a way to help others navigate their own difficult journeys. 1 year after her wedding night disaster, Sarah received an unexpected letter from Marcus. He was living in Seattle now, working for a different company, and wanted her to know that he took full responsibility for everything that had happened. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or contact, just expressing genuine remorse and gratitude that she'd been strong enough to save them both from a marriage built on lies. The letter didn't change anything fundamental about what had happened, but it gave Sarah a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Marcus had finally become the honest person she'd thought she was marrying, even though it was too late for their relationship. Sometimes people do change, but that doesn't erase the consequences of who they were before. Sarah kept the letter for a few days, then threw it away. Some apologies were worth accepting not because they fixed anything, but because they allowed you to move forward without carrying someone else's guilt along with your own healing. On a warm spring evening, almost exactly 18 months after her wedding disaster, Sarah went on her first real date since the divorce. James was a friend of Emma's, a kind veterinarian who made Sarah laugh and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and dreams. When he walked her to her door at the end of the evening, Sarah realized she felt hopeful about romantic possibilities. For the first time in over a year, she wasn't ready to rush into anything serious, and James seemed to understand that perfectly. But sitting across from someone who answered her questions directly, who showed up when he said he would, and who treated dating as an opportunity to get to know her rather than a game to be won, reminded Sarah that not all people were capable of the level of deception Marcus had practiced. The wedding disaster had taught Sarah that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, that she could survive her worst fears coming true, and that trusting again after betrayal was possible but required choosing the right people. She'd lost a marriage but gained a deeper understanding of herself and what she deserved from relationships. Most importantly, Sarah learned that some stories that begin with heartbreak can still have happy endings, just not the ones you originally planned. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is discovering that you're strong enough to save yourself, even when the person who promised to protect you turns out to be the one you need protection from.